Welcome to another episode of The Warframe is Fine. You just don't know how to play with your host, Acolyte Synpai. Originally, I was just gonna skip over Ember since she recently got a rework. I felt there wasn't much that could be said, but lord, the more I sat and thought about her abilities and how I play her, the holes in her kit started staring back at me. There's so much redundancy in her kit that the value of each of her abilities outside of like Immolation and Fireblast fall. Ember's passives grants her 5% extra ability strength for every enemy burning with an active heat status effect within 50 meters. This is a nonsensically brilliant passive. However, I can't help but scratch my head at the fact that this wasn't somehow integrated into Immolation. I feel like playing Ember the moment you spawn in the game, you're toggling on Immolation. Her first ability, Fireball, seems to exist primarily to justify its augment that adds elemental damage to allies. If it was nearly as potent as Oberon's Smite without the augment, I can imagine people using these types of first abilities more frequently. But the scaling nor efficiency of spreading fire exists in this ability, so I tend to never really even press the button. Immolation provides Ember protection based on heat generation. It's a really nice ability, but there's so little consistency and durability, unlike say Valkyr's Warcry or Rhino's Iron Skin. I've said it once and I'll say it again. Abilities like this leave this question of how much damage can I take as a player too much of a variable. I'm only ever truly aware when I'm at 50% because I recast since the energy drain was too much and casting Fireblast was too inefficient to keep up with, or at 90% because I'm spamming abilities to try to keep up the maximum DR. The overheat gameplay is interesting, but it never really feels rewarding to endure the ebb and flow when comparatively many frames offer durability without guesswork. It feels entirely inverse to how Saren plays, like someone dropped their design philosophy when they decided to punish players for playing well in order to control pace. The augment is barely passable since other frames supply more consistent damage reduction to teammates without investment. I do enjoy that Ember's other abilities are affected by this. Fireball's cast speed is increased based on the heat stored. Fireblast's armor reduction is based on the percentage, but again, it only really matters if you're at max or not. No one's looking and going, "Why yes, good sir, I'm at 80%. Allow me to reduce that much armor as it seems mighty sufficient." No! Just casting Fireblast twice while this is at the 50% minimal value leaves the enemy with 25% armor with how it stacks anyway. Lastly, Inferno gains a damage buff based on the heat percentage. Speaking of armor reduction and redundancy, Fireblast, Ember's third ability. Heat damage was changed partially because it was Ember's primary damage, and with heat damage being pretty good at reducing enemy armor by up to 50% after 2 seconds, Ember's Fireblast is now changed to reduce enemies' armor. Remember, 2 casts at minimum value and the enemies are left with 25% armor before even factoring in the heat prop. When Immolation's heat gauge is maxed at 90%, Fireblast fully removes the enemy's armor. The only caveat to this ability is that it requires line of sight, and that perplexes me. Not only because it presumably scales on range, but good luck having enemies outside of 30 meters somehow not break line of sight when other enemies can count as interference. I can find no real good design reason for that to be the case, except that it's intended to maintain the value of Inferno, at the very least, which is technically still a line of sight ability itself. Seriously, anyone got a better reason? Cause at the time of the rework, corrosive projection was at an all-time high. We have Frost, Hildren, Mag, Oberon, and Vauban that all offer much more on top of their competitive armor strip abilities. And they aren't nullified by line of sight. Sure, if it wasn't restricted by line of sight, Fireblast could be reduced in base range, but considering how Ember's abilities outside of Immolation seem to be geared around setting enemies on fire and dealing damage, this one does that and more with its permanent armor strip. The line of sight requirement also puts a questionable value on the augment itself. Like maybe without the line of sight, the augment would actually be pretty phenomenal, but I'd feel better if at the very least the excess healing became a shield as well. If I'm being honest, I wouldn't be completely mad if they removed the line of sight and just made it her fourth ability. Speaking of fourth abilities, Inferno! Although it does decent damage that scales pretty well due to Immolation, the best thing about this ability for me is its augment, and I feel like addressing the other abilities, particularly Fireblast, already clarified why this feels redundant and not really usable. So now I'll try to merge current Ember with some things I enjoyed from a 5-year-old rework of mine, and link the revamp post that was made when From the 70s and Red brought up the Ember rework discussion in the middle of last year. I'd say for a passive, add energy regeneration in tandem to the power power strength bonus for enemies affected by heat and range. I'm all for Warframes and especially casters having energy sustainability built into their kit. I dislike Fireball and would rather Fireball be replaced with Immolation. I get it, not all abilities need to be wildly effective, but one should not make abilities that will not be used. With this change, I feel like Immolation's gauge should be inverted such that it starts at the maximum and players have to try to keep it maxed instead of the opposite. I think it's a subtle but important change in perspective. Lastly, I think it would be nice if Ember sent out Seeking Fire Wisps at attackers, even if it was a % chance or added to the augment, since it doesn't provide full damage reduction anyway. For Ember's second ability, in my mind, Accelerant still works. Stun enemies in range, gain casting speed, but in addition, set them on fire, while adding a % of heat damage to Ember's weapon and abilities. Over this ability's duration, you can have enemies that die to heat damage and range explode, dealing blast damage to nearby enemies. This makes Ember having nothing but heat damage make a lot more sense, and even allows, teamwork. When this ability is cast while Immolation is maxed, it could consume Immolation and allow enemies that explode to set affected enemies on fire at an increased range. Therefore, chain on chain on chain. For her third ability, surprise, Fireblast stays and removes the line of sight requirement. For Inferno, I prefer it to be revised such that Ember absorbs fire around her and envelops herself and allies in affinity range in flames. Ember and her allies set enemies that come in range on fire. If the enemy is on fire, melee damage consumes the heat proc and deals the remaining damage in a radius. Allies under the flame's effect are granted up to double Ember's passive bonuses, depending on the amount of heat procs absorbed. Ember's Immolation damage reduction also applies to affected allies. When Ember casts Accelerant or Fireblast, the ability's effects apply in half radius around allies under Inferno's effect, while also granting them the heat damage bonus and casting speed bonuses from Accelerant. This is one of many possible Ember directions, like there's a more DPS oriented sort of design one could go, but I feel like this is a nice combination allowing Ember to act as a sort of chain DPS or in tandem with other DPS frames like Saren. Let me know in the comments how you feel about Ember's abilities. Do you have any ideas for improving her? Maybe you're fine with how she is. Why? Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Just make sure your heart is the last to burn, hotshot.